Hey everyone, welcome to Our Small Footprint. My name is Nyssa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. Today's video, I am going to attempt one of my single subject videos, which very rarely work, but we're going to give it a go. I have a third of a pork roast from Costco that I'm going to turn into breakfast sausage patties. This is one of our favourite ways to use pork when we mince it. It's so tasty and so moist, and it just works really, really well. So what I've done is I've spent 15 minutes making sure that my recipe for my breakfast sausage mix has got weights and everything so that I can share it appropriately, and I'm going to mix that up and share it with you as to the ratios that we use. Now, breakfast sausage seasoning mixes are variable. It really depends on region, taste factor, all that sort of thing. And so there is lots of play that you can make with these seasonings, but this is the way that we do it. So let me spin you around and we'll start. All right, now, as I said, super variable. Like, one of the main variations that people use is they use red pepper flakes or not. We don't use red pepper flakes, but I use a little bit of a higher ratio of black pepper. So when we're doing this amount here is enough for one of those full pork roasts. So a 7 kilo pork is about 7 kilos of mince. Obviously, I'm not going to do all 7 kilos of mince. I'm going to use about a third of this because I've got about a third of the roast left. But when I make it, I like to make it in bulk so that I've got a jar full sort of thing. Now, for me, we use flaked salt because you want a coarse salt rather than a fine one if you've got it. And I use around about the sort of 1% mark of salt, so 70 to 75 grams of salt in my thing. So we've got 7,000 grams of pork, so we're using 70 grams of salt, which is about 1% of the weight. You can go up to 2%, but I find with all these flavorings and the way you serve a breakfast sausage, normally with cheese and stuff, that 1% is a good point to start with. The other main thing is sage. Now, sage is very light for a large quantity. So for me, I use around about the 20 grams of sage over it, which is going to end up being like a 0.4% in the pork, but it can become overpowering. So I use 40 grams of rubbed dried sage. I do use some brown sugar. That's another qualification there. Some people use sugar, some people don't. I have here a monk fruit sweetener blend instead of brown sugar with a drizzle of molasses, and this will be my replacement to brown sugar, and we really like that sweet hint to it. Some people also use maple syrup. Now, we're doing the low carb thing at the moment, so we won't, but what I do have is maple flavoring. So what I can do is I can add in just a tiny, you really don't want to do too much of this because can be overpowering, tiny couple of drops into that amount with that brown sugar and that molasses, and that will get mixed through. Completely optional there too. Ground pepper. So I have black peppercorns that I have just ground up in my Tri-Best, which is personal blender, a bit like a ninja, into coarse grinds. Some of it's finer than others. We don't mind that sort of a thing. And we're going to use about the 0.5% of this, so about 30 to 35 grams of black pepper. I also use paprika in my breakfast sausage. Again, this is not in every recipe. I think it's regional or taste preference, but I really like smoked paprika in my mix, and I use again the 0.5%, the 30 to 35 grams of paprika. I like to use garlic and onion powder. Again, this is my taste preference. So what we're aiming for here is 0.5% again, so the 30 to 35 grams, but I've halved it, half ground garlic, half ground onion. And then we have some thyme as well. So we're going for less thyme here. It's a bit like the sage. It's fairly light for a large quantity. So we're only going for about the 15 to 20 grams of thyme as well, which again is like the 0.35 to 0.4%. And that is my mix. So now I'm going to whisk this up. So we're just going to whisk this all together. Now, because I've got that little drizzle of molasses in there as well, there's a little bit of moisture, so we just need to make sure that everything is blended through. You could use a food processor, Thermomix, anything like that to mix this up, but I don't find it particularly necessary. There's enough dry in there that little bit of moisture, it blends through quite easily. The biggest issue I'm having at the moment is the paprikas in lumps, so I'm just going to break that up as I go through. And then this can go in a jar, and I can use it for up to 7 kilos of breakfast sausage. So now that I've got this blended up, I'm going to put all this away and I'm going to mince up that pork from the other day. All right, so the next step is to mince the pork. So we've got 2.5 kilos of the pork roast from Costco. We're going to run it through the Louvel mincer. I say this every time I use Louvel, but I'll put an affiliate link in the description. This is a wonderful mincer. It is fairly low price, low power draw, high powered, and it just works really well. It tends to run about 1 kilo of meat through in about a minute. So it works it's highly recommend this one if you're looking for a mincer. Now, the colder your meat, the cleaner your grind, and on today's temperatures, this probably could have done with 15 to 20 minutes in the freezer, but it's 12 o'clock and this is lunch, so I didn't do that. But you could see that it was struggling a little bit, the texture of it coming through, which isn't an issue for this pork either because we're turning it into breakfast sausage, so we're going to emulsify the seasonings into it anyway. But if it is struggling a little bit and it is starting to look like a little bit like it's being mushed a little bit as it comes through the grinding plate, then stop, and you can stick this whole piece that slides off, you can stick this whole piece in the freezer as well as your meat for 15-20 minutes and let everything get nice and chilled, and then keep going. So I weighed out the seasoning mix for in total of what I ended up with, and I ended up with 270 grams of seasoning mix all up. So this is 2.5 kilos of pork. So when I made the seasoning, I made it for 7 kilos of meat. So the easiest way to calculate how much you need for whatever portion you have is that if I divide that 270 grams by the 7,000 grams that it was made for, and then times that by the amount of meat I've got. So I did 270 grams divided by the 7,000 grams times by the 2,500 grams, and ends up with 96 to 100 grams of seasoning for this amount of meat. Now, it's by choice, by taste too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 100 grams to this. I'm going to emulsify it a little bit. We'll cook a tiny little bit off, and Darryl can taste it because he's my taste tester. And if it's good, then that's good. If not, we can add a bit more seasoning to it. So I've got scales underneath the bowl here. I'm going to measure in, except it shouldn't be out, but it says it is. It's decided that's too much. It's fine. I'll use a cup to measure the seasoning into. So that's 55. So we need another 40. And we'll put that in the meat. And then I'm going to mix it, and I'm going to squeeze the meat as I'm going because we want to emulsify this meat a little bit so that it holds together in patties. So I'm going to emulsify that seasoning into the pork because we want it to hold together into little patties. If you wanted it to be like individual bits of meat, then you'd try not to work it too much, but we want to work it just enough to create patties. You also don't want to overwork it because it will end up tough. So you want to get that seasoning through nice and emulsified, but not over the top. So you can see the strands starting to form in between the pork, which is because it's being emulsified, and that's enough for it to hold together. So now we're just going to cook a bit of this off and give it a taste. All right, so Darryl tasted it. He's happy with that. So now I tend to do it into patties, and I actually prefer to store it cooked, I think, rather than raw, but sometimes I put some of the raw stuff back in the fridge and we'll cook it as we eat it. But I'm not a huge fan of making the patties and freezing them because I just find it too hard to get them right when you cook them, either from frozen or trying to defrost them and then cook them. I find it easier just to use it cooked. So what I tend to do is I weigh it all out, and I do 90-gram balls like I do with my beef patties for hamburgers and stuff. So though we could probably go a bit smaller in in sausage patties, because if I was making like English muffins and stuff, they would normally be smaller. So let's go 75-ish grams per patty. And then so all I do is I grab out chunks and I weigh in. So I let the scales keep going. So 75 and then 150 and then 225, and get a bunch of them at the right weight, and then I stick them all in the pan. So we're going 300, 375, and then 450, a little bit too much on that one, 450, 525, and 600, which is a good amount to just stop at. It saves my maths brain going any further than that. So 600 there. And then so I've got all the patties, and all I do is I flatten them out. I don't worry about flattening them out excessively like I do with my beef patties. It's not quite the same thing for me. Beef patties I like to be really nice and thin and smashed, but pork patties I'm not as concerned. So I tend to just roll them into a ball in my hand, flatten them out slightly like this, and then press them a little bit as they go into the pan. And we've just got cast iron that's really nice and piping hot, and get them pressed out there. I do have a cast iron burger press, but I find that it sticks too much. I think the problem is that most of the problem is that I use these high-sided pans, and they're more for like a flat griddle. So I just don't have enough room to maneuver. I think Susan sent it to me and I love it, but I think it's more for like what are the most Americans, the Blackstones, the flat grills, and maybe at some point we'll have one of those, because it would make life easier when making bulk stuff. But at the moment, it's just not something that would work in my situation. So 5 patties on there, and we're just going to cook them through nice and well. I find once you can see them starting to cook about halfway up the edges, and that's about ready to turn them, and you want some good colour on them to do that. So we've got this lovely caramelisation, that Maillard reaction to the fats going on the other side, and that adds so much flavour to it. And part of that's the sugar content as well, which is partly why I like adding that sweetener in there, because that sweetener adds to the caramelisation of the pork as well, and gives it that lovely colour too, which it's appealing to look at, which makes it appealing to eat. So I'll put a photo in here of the tray full. I forgot to film it, but I took a photo of it. So the patties ended up being about 34 patties at about 75 grams, which was a really nice amount for us for a few meals. And then Darryl and I are just having them with some sliced cheese and an egg and a bit of the Mingle barbecue sauce, the low carb barbecue sauce. You can't see that. No, okay. So that's how we're having it. I gave a plate full of eggs and meat patties to the sausage patties to the kids, and they're going to have them on wraps as like breakfast wraps for lunch.